Hello and welcome back. It's my great good fortune to be sitting here today with Devi Ma for a live question and answer session and guided meditation. And I just wanted to let all of you know who are watching out there in Facebook land and radio land that if you'd like to experience more of the ashram's live streaming and on-demand programming, you can find more at www.satsanglive.com.au. Hi, Devi Ma.
Hi. Nice to be here with you.
Thank you for joining us today.
And hello, everyone. Nice to be with you also.
So I wanted to talk to you a bit today about your experiences and how you came into this really rich lineage. For those of you who are watching at home, the lineage that we come from is called the shaktipat lineage. It's a central pillar of our spiritual practice here. And so I wanted to ask you, Devi Ma, what was your shaktipat experience? And can you give a definition of what shaktipat is for the people watching at home?
Well, it's hard to give a definition. Let's start there. And I'm happy to talk about it because it was really the greatest moment of my life, probably, receiving that, having that experience and receiving what they call God's grace or the Guru's grace, which is the definition given by the sages of what it is. So, yeah, it was 1974, and I was living in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and I was working at the university as a counseling students. I was a Gestalt therapist back then. And my partner at the time was in graduate school of psychology, and he was going to the U of M. And one afternoon he came home and said, did I want to go meet a guru? And I said, what's a guru? A swami. Oh, a swami. He said, Ripley's Believe It or Not, the guy lying on a bed of nails. That was the only kind of swami I knew about. So I said, well, sure, why not? Because one of his professors had invited us to meet the swami. So that day, the afternoon came around, and we drove up to what looked like a fraternity house. And there were big black letters across the top of the building. It said City Yoga Dham. And we walked in, and the Swami was Baba Muktananda, and he was in the lounge room or the living room, sitting on a small couch, very similar to this, if you can see it. I don't know if you can. And it was a beautiful fall day, which is unusual for Ann Arbor. And the light was streaming in behind him, and he was a warm orange glow. He was all dressed in orange, and he was just so warm and radiant, which I didn't know at the time that's the word I would have described. So I walked in the room and I sat down, and as I sat down, our eyes met, and I felt welcomed, although no words were spoken. And I sat down on the floor, and within 2 seconds, I felt a pull inside to go within, and so I did. And then it must have been about 20 minutes later, my partner shook me, and I came out of this, what was now I know was a deep, deep meditation. So we had to go because we were picking up my Gestalt mentor, and we had to go to the airport. So as I stood up, I realized that I had gone so deep within myself that I touched a place that was previously unknown, that I didn't even know had within me. And it was peaceful and beautiful and warm and connected. And I felt totally myself. Later, I found out that I had touched the self. And that was my first kind of shaktipat experience, or my first experience of touching the inner self, which Baba had been talking about when I went into that trance. Then by a series, I had to leave, and then because I was busy the whole time Baba was there, so I never got to go back to see him. But then by a series of synchronicities or coincidences, one of the Swamiji, or Shankar as he was known then, was running that place, the City Yoga Dham, which I found out was an ashram. Mm. And they needed a therapist. He wanted to run communication groups for the residents there. And so I had been counseling one of the people that lived there, and she suggested me. So they called me up and said, can you come and talk to Swamiji? He wants to run a communication group. So called me up, and I, ran a little session with a couple of the Ashramites, and he and his then wife Girija said, okay, well, let's do this group. So in exchange for doing the group, I said that they could, they offered me to take the first intensive in Ann Arbor, which Swamiji would be giving. Baba had moved on. He was touring America. And so I agreed. I said, okay, I wanted to learn to meditate, so I learned to meditate. So a few weeks after the group was there, the intensive came around, and I didn't know what to expect, really. And from it, and I was keen to learn, but I had no idea. I had no idea what to expect, and it was a complete surprise to me. So during before we did the first meditation, when Swamiji would come around and bless us with the feathers, he gave a talk on the inner self and, described the experience of the self. And I resonated to it because of what happened. I understood it because of what had happened with Baba. And I was, keen to have that experience again. And so the time comes, and, we're given certain instructions to close our eyes and turn within and chant the mantra Om Namah Shivaya, which was being played on the harmonium. And Swamiji came around, and he was touching everyone, and I could feel the energy building as he came closer to me. And so he hit me on the head and pinched my eyebrows and moved off. And as he was moving off, I felt as though my hands had been plugged into about, 1,000 volts of electricity. So the electricity, oddly enough, started in my hands, and it went up. This feeling of this charge went up my hands, up my arms, went up to my head. And as it was flowing through me, it became stronger and stronger and stronger. When it got to my head, it did a turnaround and plummeted to my toes, and then moved up, came into my heart, and my heart exploded in this, what I can only describe as divine love. Mm. Suddenly, out of nowhere, I was filled with joy and bliss and love. And not only that, when I opened my eyes, my insides had radically changed. My whole center of gravity, my being, was suddenly alive. I looked out at the room, and everything was beaming with these sparkles of blue light, which I now know is chitti beams, or energy beams. And everything was moving. And so there were many other things that happened that day. But really, that was the moment at which I felt that I was so transformed. Because before that, I had looked out at the world as inert, material.
Right.
The world, it was material world, objects. They had no life. The world had no life, real life in it. And I was searching for something that would end my existential angst, you could say, my own suffering. Because as a therapist, how can I help anyone if I haven't solved the problem of my own suffering?
Right.
So I was always in a bit of a dilemma about it. I mean, I did my best, but my best I knew very clearly wasn't good enough. But this was something so unique and so unexpected, it was unimaginable that I could be so transformed in a second from this sort of dead person to this fully alive person. That was my shaktipat. And I had many, many experiences of the Shakti, and finally it calmed down. And even though, I had to go through many things in terms of my purifying my mind and my emotions, still that place in me never left. That place that I found from that moment. And so it's the greatest gift. It's the greatest possible thing that can happen to a person.
It's so beautiful. It's such a radical paradigm shift that
Totally.
you ended up now devoting the majority of your life to being in service of the Shakti
Well,
and Guru.
that was a thank you to God, to the Guru, to Swamiji, to Baba. Thank you for changing my life in this way, for giving me such a profound understanding of who I truly am and what potential is within me. And so I made a commitment in that moment to always serve the Guru.
Mm. Can you talk about what makes someone a devotee, and how do we grow our connection to the Guru and the Shakti?
Well, I think that self-concern is probably the biggest thing that's in the way of serving. Worrying about material things. If you have that desire for a spiritual life, and love or devotion for the Guru, and a desire for a deeper understanding, that's all one needs. And then you have to, as you go through your stuff, which happens, worldly desires come up, fears come up, fear about lack of money, fear about the future, fear about, whatever, the stuff of life. I mean, we all know what that is.
Mm.
You have to just remember the self, but also I always wanted to make a contribution. I wanted to make a contribution to life, to people, to humanity, to whatever. I mean, I just had a desire to serve, and I knew that my service had to give me something. It had to be the right kind of service. Like I tried different things. Even being a therapist, was limited because of my point of view at that time, which was I saw things through mundane eyes. And of course, I still ran groups after that, but they were from a different place. They were from a place of divinity. Instead of looking for how, dealing with a person's suffering from the therapeutic point of view, I started offering them possibilities from a spiritual point of view.
Mm.
And that radically changed the way I spoke to people. And so if you want to be of service, be of service.
Mm.
It's not that hard. But self-concern is the one thing that gets in the way.
Mm. And those blocks that we experience, you and Swamiji developed a method for addressing those that you eventually came to call the Shiva process. So can you talk about the ways that self-inquiry and sadhana might differ from therapy? And can they ever coexist side by side?
Well, I mean, I sometimes you need therapy. Sometimes a person needs therapy to work through, emotional, you could say, deep emotional trauma if it's there. Sometimes you need to go to someone and talk about it. Now, that's not from a certain point of view, although I always use my therapeutic techniques with people, but that's not what Shiva process is. It's a form of Shiva process because my perspective has changed in terms of what I said. My vision of how I want to talk to people has changed. But if you need therapy, then go to a therapist. However, the therapist also has to find a way to understand your spiritual, where you are spiritually. Because a lot of therapists don't believe in the power of the Guru, and so you have to be careful. But, they can work very well together. And as I said, I still use some of my therapeutic techniques in the Shiva process groups that I run. I think they go together, as long as the therapist doesn't try to talk you out of being with a guru, if you have a guru.
Right.
Yeah.
And could you describe how Shiva process works in getting rid of the blocks that prevent the flow of Shakti?
Yeah. The thing is, pain, suffering creates blocks. And what is suffering made of? It's thought and feeling.
Mm.
And so Swamiji developed the method because, in therapy, I mean, by the time I met Swamiji, I was sick to death of my mind because I've been in therapy and running groups for over 2 years. And I just thought there's got to be something more. There just has to be something more than endlessly going on about my mind and these things that come up. So I was very keen to make a paradigm shift, as you said, from looking at things a certain way. So when Swamiji developed the technique, he focused on feeling, but it's different than talking about your feelings to a therapist, because he cut short the stories that we tell ourselves when we are suffering. And so the story is less important than just knowing how you feel in any given moment. And then once you recognize how you feel in any given moment, then that can release whatever suffering is there. So if we're mad, we say, I'm mad. If we're sad, we say, I'm sad. If we're happy, we say, I'm happy. If we're scared, we say, I'm scared. And the power of that, what he calls an A statement, is an A statement can release us in a split second from any pain that we might be in, just by recognizing the movement of our feeling within us. Mm. And so that gets rid of the block. Recognition of our state, our present state, as I said, in any given moment, is actually the way to freedom from suffering. Mm. It's so simple.
Yeah,
so
but we aren't taught that growing up, No,
we're not taught it. Where do they teach it? I saw a psychiatrist when I was, a teenager. Mm. And, he didn't talk like that. He didn't say, where's your feeling?
Yeah. I think a lot of my life would have ended up much less contracted if, when I was little, someone would have sat me down and said, you're going to think some things and they're not all true.
That's right. That's exactly right. Yeah. And, because feeling is really present in a person, whereas thoughts can be so scattered and so all over the place. It's very hard to calm the mind. But once we learn how to acknowledge our feeling state, it brings the mind present. Hmm. And without positive feeling, there's no joy in life. There's no bliss. If we don't process our unhappiness and identify it and recognize it, there's no possibility for joy. There's no possibility for real love. There's only suffering or pain or contraction.
One of the radical things I think about this tradition that Baba Muktananda taught is that the ability to self-reflect and the energy of upliftment, the shakti itself, we come to know as the goddess. And you're a great lover of the goddess. So can you talk about how our sadhana might benefit from working with the shakti or having this understanding?
Yeah, well, when we're in pain, we're out of touch with the shakti. And the shakti in this case, is that vibration of energy that pulsates within us after we awaken. Mm. So what we want to do is we want to try to always move our mind towards that rather than whatever thoughts are creating a separation from that energy. Now, of course, Swamiji is a big fan of, what he calls the upward shift of energy, because there's nothing worse than depleting our energy. And that happens with negative thinking, negative self-talk. Mm. And so to nurture the shakti, we have to move our mind. We have to remember her. We have to remember that such a thing exists in us, that we have this incredible potential within us. And it's always there, even, when we're not thinking in the right way. She's still present. Mm. And she's still there. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
No, it does. We have this kind of incredible creative capacity that we can use for the forces of good or the forces of
self-destruction.
Yeah, self-destruction.
Yeah. The mind can be very destructive. Now we know that, because we live with our mind. So we know how it can torture us and treat us, and also treat the ones we love. It can, we could attack ourselves with what Swamiji calls tearing thoughts, negative thinking, or we can attack others. And that thing called tearing thoughts destroys relationships. Because relationships are sacred. They begin in love. And then, the stuff of the world comes in, and that takes precedence over the love, having to do things, having to get things done, having to earn a living, having to pay a mortgage, having to do all that stuff. It comes in to the relationship, and the relationship starts to, the love that was there in the beginning starts to ebb. And so in order to keep love alive, we have to work on ourselves. And we have to work on keeping our hearts open, no matter what happens in life, no matter what we go through. And yes, there are terrible things that can happen to us. But always, in order to recover, to heal, to rejuvenate, to stay in touch with the Shakti, we have to keep our hearts open.
You guide a wonderful practice in getting present that helps people access that openness of their own heart. And I know today you wanted to guide a bit of meditation.
Yeah.
So I was hoping that you would share that with us today.
Sure. All right. So this is one of my favorite meditations. And I call it being present. So, yeah. The way we do it is we close our eyes. And we turn within. And, it's not uncommon for the mind to put up some resistance to meditation. It'll come up with all kinds of reasons. You don't have time. You can't meditate. Your mind's too busy. You got too many things to do. It'll come up with all kinds of reasons why you shouldn't meditate. It just does. But it's important not to pay attention to the objections of the mind to turn within, because it's turning within that gives us the understanding and knowledge to shift whatever is going on in the mind. So just notice if your mind is putting up a resistance. And the thing about inquiry is that it's about noticing, becoming conscious, being aware of what's going on within. It's not about changing it or fixing it. Because the interesting thing about meditation is that if we just watch the mind in all its play, whether it's positive or negative, eventually we will go deeper. Eventually, the mind will surrender to what you're asking it to do, which is to go deeper within yourself. To go deeper within yourself. And that's where all the good stuff is. And as we become more present to our inner world, we'll notice different subtle sensations or different energetic movements. Some of them might be pleasant, some of them might be unpleasant. You might notice your breathing, whether it's steady or whether it's a little bit agitated. And remember, we're just becoming aware of this place, this great ocean of the self that is within us. And the more we become present, the more we can see that as we are present, that we sit between two infinities. At least I like to call them two infinities. And when we become present, these two infinities disappear into the present. But when we're not present to the self, they play in our minds. On the one hand, there's the past. All of our experiences up to this moment. Your good experiences, bad experiences. Everything that's gone before us. And even if we go back to our first memory, even before our first memory, we existed. And so it does seem to stretch into an infinity, and it holds our regrets, our successes, our disappointments, our joys, memories. Coulda, woulda, shoulda. All the stuff that we carry about the past is there, held in consciousness. And then on the other hand, there's the future. That too seems to stretch into infinity. It's unknown. And it can hold our fears, our hopes, our wishes, our dreams, our desires. It's a mystery. Who knows what can happen tomorrow or in 2 weeks? But the future is not yet here. It's a fantasy. It's a potential. But it hasn't happened yet. And then, when we bring our attention back to the present moment, this moment, right now, wherever you are, we can feel the aliveness of this moment here now. We know that we are alive. We exist. And it's in this moment that has all the greatness of the self, the potential of the self. We can call on the self. We can experience the self. The mind is only focused here, now. And in this moment, we can sense a vibration, the energy of the self. And it's in this moment that all solutions, all questions have the possibility to be answered. And in this moment, we can experience that whatever arises is me, is within me. All thoughts, all feelings are me. Let's sit quietly for a few minutes and try to feel the presence of your own being. Make contact with your own being. Okay, we'll open our eyes, come back to the room. I just want to say one thing about making contact with yourself, which is that from that place, all your relationships work much better when you're making contact with your inner being. Everything flows, work flows, life just works better. So practice that little meditation at home. And I think you'll find that when you make contact, you'll be much happier. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Devi Ma.
You're welcome.
And once again, if you'd like to check out more of our meditation or self-inquiry programs, they're available on our website, www.satsanglive.com.au. And we'll see you next time.
And check out my blog,
Yes.
devimasaraswati.com. Thanks.